All right, good morning. It is 2 minutes before 10. And thank you for those who joined in earlier. And a number of you are coming in slowly. Thank you. We do have about four over at YouTube. Just say hi over there. Uh, okay, so we will get started in a few minutes. All right. Good morning. I'm seeing some from PIA we have there. Leah, also Cynthia from Napolcom. Good morning. Edita as well. Joy Marie, MNWD. Good morning. How is it where you are, guys? It's a little gloomy outside. I don't know if that means it's going to rain a little bit. Okay. From Bukidnon, right? Mandaluyong also a little bit cloudy. Marawi and Lanao, how is it there? Is it sunny? Okay. Good morning from Zamboangas. It's sunny in Marawi. It's cloudy here in Bulacan. Okay. Well, so it's already 10, so let's get started. Again, thank you for coming and joining our session today. We are broadcasting this live so that others can join over at YouTube if they cannot enter Zoom. And also, we are broadcasting it so that it gets saved and some of you can even review or rewatch the video later on or even share it with some of your friends, especially if the topic today that we're going to cover is going to be important for them and you feel is going to give them some value. And you know what we're talking about, right? We are going to talk about some of the pitfalls in competency models so that we can end up strengthening it. Now, this session is best for those who already have a competency model. But if you are joining and you don't have a competency model, you're just getting started, you're in the middle of it, or you don't know, you're not sure if you want to get into it, it's still going to benefit you because, again, we're going to talk about things that you can correct if you're in the middle of the process or things that you might want to watch out for once you're going to start with the project. Now, let me know over chat how long has it been for some of you who have competency models? How long has it been since you started using or developing it? Let's see some of those in the chat box. 4 years, all right. Thank you. 6 months, so that's fresh. 6 months. You just set it up today. What about the others? All right. We are just about to start. Okay. 4 years also. It looks like so that's the average, around 5-6 years for some of you who have competency models. All right. Okay. Okay. We're just going to get started. Somebody was saying we started our competency development project, but we stumbled on some challenges. So that's why we stopped. Also, somebody else was saying 4 years na po and stagnant ang aming competency model. All right. So we will not be able to cover how you can jumpstart it because, of course, getting a competency model started is dependent on the gatekeepers or some stakeholders. But if you do decide to continue doing that, what are some of the things that you'd like to be prepared for? Okay, and maybe that's going to be what's helpful. We hope to start doing it, establishing our competency model next year. All right. The best time to do a competency model was 9 years, 10 years ago when it actually started, at least in the public sector, but it has been around since the 90s. In the 90s, many organizations started looking into competencies, and today it's actually become one of the more popular, if not famous, and stable frameworks for HR development. And it took a little while before that technology got into the public sector. So we actually really started using a lot of these models and seeing many of these models sometime during the early 90s. Okay? Even if you're going to do competencies just now, it's actually a very good time because that means all of the dust has settled. I remember when we were starting doing competency models as back in the 90s, there were more questions and there were more exceptions rather than rules. Today, a lot of those exceptions have been clarified, and we've come to a point wherein there are some prevailing rules or conditions or guidelines by how you create a competency model. So I guess it's much better at this point if you're going to do it now. Never too late. Okay. Also, one more. We are in the process. This is from ZCMC, Florencio. Um, we are in the process of implementing our competency model. We have done our strategic planning, which is good. Actually, you're going to hear a little bit more about that, and we are able to plan for our learning and development plan. Over at Facebook, we do have someone saying hello there. Uh, we actually attended. Oh, I'm from your CSI class. All right, welcome. Thank you for joining. All right, so let's get started. So I wanted to talk about some of the pitfalls because I've worked with many agencies and they've shared some of their stories about the use of competency models. Or again, for some of you who are sharing some of the gaps or friction you've encountered in really making use of competency. So this is really about a topic. The topic is really about the pitfalls so that you can act on them and begin strengthening your competency model. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go through some statistics that have or some data that are actually already out there. It's done. It was done by this was done by Brandon Hall Consulting, another firm that also does competency models, and they went into a research just to be able to convince many more organizations to want to get into competency models. Um, and the reason we're talking about this because ultimately what a competency model should do is number one, help your HR. But if you help your HR, ultimately you're going to help the organization, right? And for those who have stabilized and were successful in their integration of competencies, according to the study, Brandon Hall found out that they succeeded in many several areas precisely because of that foundation of a competency model. So here are those data. So number one, for many companies, for those using competency models, they found out that as a result, they saw increased financial conditions by 55%. Also, they were able to improve their customer retention 45%. Obviously, these are companies that are more consumer or public orientated. You might translate customer retention as loyalty, for example. Also, brand image perception. And financial conditions might not only be in earnings, but also even in expenditure optimization and management. Also, based on the data, 41% improved their internal processes because of they have a working competency model. And then 30% also were able to increase, 37%, sorry for that, 37% were able to increase their employee engagement. So meaning, so long as you have a competency model, it's embedded really, really well, you will be able to reap these kinds of results or the level of results. Notice the first one, increased financial conditions, that seems very strategic. You're actually pleasing stakeholders at that level. Increasing customer retention, that means you're improving your business, you're improving your organization. And increased internal process obviously talks about the conditions within the organization. And then employee engagement, you are talking about the drivers, your human resource. So the effect or impact of a competency model is actually really big. So here's a quick question over chat. Are you at that point wherein you are seeing these kinds of results right now in your organization, given that you have that model? At least for those of you who said, we've had it, Lito, for 4 years and or 5 years. Not yet. Ha ha ha. All right. You find humor in that. All right. What else? Uh, how were organizations able to conclude that it was the competency model that created those results? Well, first there's a chain of evidence. I think the balance scorecard illustrates this very very clearly, right? If you have a very good learning and growth perspective, in other words, people are capable, you have a very good culture, you have the technologies by which to produce, then you're able to do good processes. These good processes lead to happy customers. These happy customers lead to financial results. And that chain emanates from competence, having the skill, capability of the organization. So that's one way. Number two, obviously, trying to compute the ROI, looking at the difference of how you do something without the competency model first, and then how you do it differently today, or how it's going right now because of a competency model. And when you compare the two, that's when you begin finding out what were the benefits or what changes the presence of a competency model did for you. All right. Okay. Any more comments? Let's see. Mabilis masyado. All right. Let me let me try and slow my. Okay. We haven't seen those kinds. All right. So if you have not seen those kinds of results, it could be that again, how we're using our competency model is not at that ideal level yet. And it could be because we we've encountered some of the pitfalls that I've seen happen to many organizations when they embark on a competency model project. And I'm going to share with you right now what the three main pitfall areas of competency design. So get a pen or paper. Number one, write this down. Number one, we do see, I have seen many organizations going to competencies having firstly design issues with their model or framework. Okay? At this point, we're just going to interchange the use of those two words, no, framework and models. So number one has to do with design. Number two, pitfall has to do with uh, their launch of the competency project, and then number three has to do with sustainability. Okay. So those are the three areas wherein we are seeing some errors or pitfalls happening that might be preventing you from looking at the kind of results that we just mentioned earlier. And by the way, the results might not even be quantifiable. In fact, in the Brandon study, they said, and that's because they couldn't go deep and do the number crunching, but they found out that because of competency models, the strategy, culture, and vision of the organization was reinforced. Also, they found out that success criteria of jobs became clearer. And then also, in terms of approaches to development, they became more systematic and deliberate because of a competency model, and also enabled employee mobility. Now, and because there are a lot of moving parts there, it's probably hard to do again the number crunching and find out the data or the ROI that we saw earlier. We heard earlier about finance, customer retention, but they're still really terms that are in the happy tone, right? Reinforced, deliberate, more effective, systematic, and enabled. So the issues again are design, launch, and maintain. So let's dive deep into these three. Let's look at the design first. Okay. So in the design, usually, and sorry, okay, I'll make sure that I get to the questions in a moment. Uh, all right. We're going to answer some of the questions in a moment. But thank you. Keep them coming. And I'll be on guard for uh, some of the questions that might be useful in our discussion. But the first one is design. All right. And the reason why many already fail in doing a competency model is because in terms of their design, they were really never really clear about the why. Okay. WHY, the why of their competency model. Why do you need to create one? Okay. Let me see for some of you, and you can comment over chat. Was the why ever clear in the first place? Why did you do a competency model? And there are three possible reasons, by the way. Okay. So number one It's because of a strategy that your organization identified. And of course, every strategy requires certain skills to be able to achieve that. And normally, if you're fresh out of your strategy development or strategic planning, one of you did mention that over chat, if you are at that level wherein you identified a strategy, you would like to begin thinking about what competencies do we need in order to fulfill that strategy. So it's a very simple exercise, right? But the why is also very transparent. We need these competencies because of our strategy. I remember one of the stories that I used to share about this was the story of Nike when they shifted from what they used to do, which was largely distribution, and they wanted to get into to become, at least in terms of their vision, to become the number one sports brand in the world. Also, I think one of their mission statements or anecdotal, but I recall reading this in the book by Philip Knight, Shoe Dog, was to annihilate Reebok. Because if you remember, in the 80s, Reebok was more famous and was more known over Nike. In fact, I think here in the Philippines, we pronounced Nike differently. I don't know how many of you remember that, but it was before we said, we used to think that it was Nike, diba? Not Nike. So that's an indicator of our unfamiliarity with the brand. And Reebok was the first to mind. So when Nike wanted to make that transition, they set up that strategy again, be the number one sports brand in the world, or number two, annihilate Reebok. They knew that they needed new skills to be able to achieve that. And these skills were the ones that led them to become, well, the powerhouse that they are now. They shifted, they didn't want, they felt that their competence should be in design and in branding, and also in research. They shifted, they decided one of our competencies, let's say manufacturing, shouldn't be our core. Let's pass that over. And that was because the why was clear. This is where we want to go. This is what we need to be good at. Right? So that's number one. So did your organization create or develop your competency model because of a new strategy? And so that's one. Again, many just create a model without even asking a why. Strategy could be one of them. Number two, another reason of why you might want to create a competency model is because of your current performance. And performance is more or less, you might like to think of it as the middle portion of that strategy, right? Usually when we define a strategy, it's 3 years or 5 years, and in the middle you have your milestones, and your milestones will tell you whether you're on the path towards your strategy or not. And when you're on the path, that tells you maybe all of the skills that we identified, the competencies we said we needed, were relevant and really are going to lead us to our strategy. Or number two, if your performance outcomes, your milestones tell you that you are not there yet, you are having some weaknesses in this area, some gaps in this area, that should cause you to come back and ask, what skills are we missing? What competencies need to be present in order for us to correct our path and move even faster towards our strategy. So that's a middle portion. And again, the list of competencies that you identify on the first level, wherein you identify your strategy, versus the second, wherein you're looking at your current performance, could be very different. Like in the case of Nike, reaching their strategy to be the number one sports brand, their key competencies might be um, branding, imaging, marketing, a little bit around that. If, for example, along that path they found out it's not working, then you look at other competencies that contribute to that. Is it because, let's say, we lack critical thinking skills? Is it because we don't have a very good analytics framework? And those two, again, are we can reveal competencies that are missing that can support the competencies you earlier identified that would achieve the strategy. Okay. Let me know if that's clear or you have any questions. Let's also check our YouTube, if any. So far, so good. a little bit fast in talking, all right? And that's because we're trying to fit in everything in 1 hour. Okay, clear so far? All right, nice. Okay, what's the third? The third reason of why you want to create a competency model, if it's not because you have a new strategy or because of performance, and it's maybe because there are pockets of development that you want to happen within the organization. The thing is, when you look at these three reasons, and this is because some have asked, can I create a competency model because of the three? Normally, you want to create a competency model because of any one of these, because these are very different conditions. Number one, if you just set out strategy, you want to prioritize how to achieve that strategy. So you want to prioritize the competencies that are required for that strategy. And when you think about those competencies, you will realize that it's not every position and it's not everybody in the organization who need to have that competence. Only those who have a clear or direct relationship to the strategy. So that tells you your catalog or library of competencies that respond to the strategy could be a little bit shorter, leaner, around maybe 10 key competencies, and the number of people that you require to be competent in those areas would also be a little bit finite. Not everybody is connected to the strategy, right? Others um, have no clear ownership. They do support it. They have a contributory impact to the strategy, but they're not directly accountable. Those directly accountable must be the ones to have those competencies to achieve the strategy. So, strategy is a big thing, but the competency library is smaller, and the number of people that you will end up developing and looking at if they have those competencies, you will also be a little bit small. Versus performance, you're now going in deeper into the organization, you're going to end up identifying a lot more competencies. And definitely, many more people will be involved in that exercise, trying to find out, do they demonstrate this or do they have gaps? Now, the third one is when the thing the questions you have around, are we doing well with the strategy, are not as significant anymore, and maybe in terms of performance you're on a good glide path. Pockets of non-performance, you can immediately correct them. If you've achieved the two, that means we no longer need to have the key competencies for these two because we are doing well. That's the only time that you look at the third reason of wanting to create a competency model. And that's really supporting everybody else's development because now you can afford. Think about this. If you just set up your strategy and you create a competency model to take care of everybody, you're actually going to end up losing on your resources, even on your focus, because you might be developing somebody requiring competencies that have no linkage to the strategy. So it's actually a waste of time. So you need to be clear about what is the reason or what is my why in doing a competency model. Is it because, number one, we want to support the strategy? And you stop there. If that is the reason, identify the competencies, check who needs to demonstrate those, and then find out if they have it or if they don't, and then begin supporting them. And that should simplify the process. If for example you're in the middle cycle of your strategy, then you ask, how are we doing in our targets? Is it and what's causing the gaps? Is it more people or processes or other things? If you zero in, it's a competency issue, then begin asking what competencies need to be present, what do we need to close? And if again everything is clear, there is no issue, or your strategy is doing well, performance outcomes still on the glide path, then you begin looking at everybody else in the organization. I mentioned this also because it can be overwhelming. Let me know over chat, how big are your agencies or organizations? It's really hard, right? If you're trying to manage a large competency library, you're also trying to manage the development and closing the gaps of very a large number of people. 2,000 is actually already large, right? Especially if for every position you're requiring maybe 10 competencies. 5 is the best practice right now. 10, I think, is the practice in the government, a range of as low as 8 competencies and as many as 12 competencies, right? For every position, and then 2,000, that's actually a lot. And yeah, and there you go. If you have 100 competencies in your entire library, you're actually looking at that. Now, here's a quick exercise that I'd like you to do, especially if some of you, if you have your um, competency catalog in front of you. Maybe for some of you, you have it in your wallets because it's dear to you. You have it right beside your table because it's you've made it into a poster. But quickly look at that and try to check how many of this in your competency library, and it could be, again, as some of you said in the chat, 100, which of them really relate to the strategy? You'll realize that they're really just a couple of them, right? You might say communication is needed, but that's not core, right? That's something that you check over uh, in recruitment, one of the skills that you use, but it's not a competency per se that is really relevant to the strategy. So meaning, if you did define it based on the strategy, if that was your why, definitely it's a much shorter list, right? So let me know again. So given this lesson, are you now thinking of, all right, how will we design and or how did we design? Can we rethink this? Yep, definitely. Again, because you won't see the results that ideally a competency should do because you actually are stuck more in trying to get it to work because of that large library and that large human resource that you want to provide capability for. Okay, so that's the number one issue. Over chat, some of you are saying guilty. We need to check this. All right. I think we're clear. Somebody was saying, good for you then. So this is not your pitfall area. So if that means more or less based on this conversation, well, you have a relative strength of your competency model. Okay, so that's number one. Um, Design issue has to do with the why. Over somebody else was saying over chat, it was really more compliance. Ha ha ha. And that's good if that's compliance, and I understand because there are some certifying bodies that require an organization to have a competency model. I think for some of the ISO certifications, some outfits do require it. In the government, for example, if you are a GOCC, you are required to have a competency model because of the governance commission. Um, and so maybe in order to fulfill that requirement, you put together a competency model without actually asking the why. So it was more reactive rather than reflective. And I hope you got the idea that really when you want to do a competency model, you want to have a more reflective approach. Make it practical, make it serve you rather than enslave you. So now, if you didn't think about the why, likely you're trapped into trying to manage that, again, that large competency model. And you're just managing it. You're not yet even integrating, not even maturing it at this point. So in the design, you're already trapped. Does the quality standard require competency? I think this is a question for those of you in the public sector. At the moment, it's not. The quality standards in the public sector only require education, experience, training, and eligibility. And you might say, well, competencies are implied there. Unfortunately, it's not measured outright. They're just asking, do you have this level of education? Do you have this many training hours? And almost it is assumed that because you have these training hours or you have this level of education, that you have this a certain level of competence already. But let me ask you, and this is a question I often ask in many of my workshops and engagements. Have you met people who have a certain degree or certain hours of training and yet seem to not demonstrate the competency you were hoping they would be able to show in light of their tenure or their educational attainment? There you go. Not all. Yeah. So so that tells you that while the QS seems to be a gate of sorts, it doesn't actually guarantee competence. I mean, for we don't know how you got the degree. Did you acquire the degree based on competence, or did you acquire it through some other means? Or if you did acquire it through competence, which competencies? because you might interpret, oh, this person is good in project management, maybe they're good in planning. But apparently, that skill in project management was achieved because of a competence in communication, and not exactly via a competence in planning. So it can give you clues, but education, experience, training, and eligibility are simply indicators of competence. You really want to measure competency differently. We're going to talk about competency assessment maybe in another session. But yeah, I think that's an important question to ask. Okay. Good morning for Esmael joining over at YouTube. Okay. All right. So let's move on. So that's number one reason in design. Number two, or number one fault in the design, the why of a competency model. Number two pitfall in the design of a competency model has to do with how you articulate the competencies. When we say articulate, how you define it and how you create the criteria for that will tell you if the competency is present or otherwise. What's an example? Let's say because of the strategy or because of your performance trend, or because of how you want to support your employees, one competency you said was important was communication. Now that you've identified or labeled the competency, you want to begin articulating, what do you mean by communication? How should people communicate so that they achieve, again, the strategy or the performance outcome, or so that they develop themselves? And what you come out as answers would be behaviors or the criteria for that competency. You might say, to achieve to be more effective in a respective job, in their jobs, the way they communicate should be this way. Number one, they should follow the rules of grammar. Number two, they should be able to adjust their communication style when they talk to stakeholders. Number three, they should be able to under or simplify complex and technical messages and ensure that they are clear and can be understood. So you call these your indicators. Some, I think they call it um, criteria or standards. But nonetheless, they're really just descriptions of the competency. It's a way for you to tell if somebody is demonstrating the competency that you're requiring. So if they don't follow the rules of grammar, if they cannot adjust their communication style, or if they cannot simplify complex or technical material, then that will tell you they're not able to demonstrate the competency of communication. So it's a way of telling, right? Now, one of the problems in this area, however, in those standards, is that some of the standards are not output based. Some of the standards are more input. So, what do I mean by this one? When you say input, they're more activities rather than outcomes. And you want to see outcomes because outcomes are the proof of a competency. If it's just an input, let's say, uh, ri- um, writes carefully, writes carefully is not an indicator of excellent communication. It's just your input for that. So you might want to change the behavior and make it more output based rather than input based. So there's a lot that I've seen in many competency tables, many competency indicators that are not written well, which is why by the time you want to use it for assessment, you begin going through certain challenges of how to measure it. So that's number one. Number two, also related to competency articulation, has to do with what I call hardware and software conflict. So, what do we mean by this one? The hardware, you can think of the hardware as your organization culture, the dynamics, the realities of your organization, your structure. Um, in IT parlance, of course, we refer to hardware as our computer, our laptop. And the software is what you want to run in with the hardware. Now, going into the IT example first, let's say you have a Windows device. That's your hardware, and the software that you are intending to put into your hardware to run into your hardware is an OS, is a Mac OS. So is a software that runs on a Mac operating system. Because the operating system, the software requires a different operating system, there's going to be a disconnect, right? There you go. It's not going to run. The Mac OS software simply will not run on that Windows device. And you can use that analogy when you begin creating or articulating some of your competency behaviors. What's an example? Let's say one of the competencies you require is performance management. I think this is a standard competency that we see across many organizations. Usually, we associate that for leadership positions. We want our leaders to be competent in managing performance. Maybe one of the indicators or criteria we have for that is for a manager, they should provide timely and effective feedback to airing performance, something like that, right? So notice again, provide timely and effective feedback to non-performance. So that's your criteria for performance management. You know they're doing the competency if they're doing the action, they're providing feedback. Now here's a question. So that's the competency. That's the competency you want to install in your hardware, in your culture, in your organization. And and the software is simply that criteria, provide timely feedback. Now part of the hardware, however, is the culture. Now let me ask this question, and we're going to use the Filipino context, no, and that's because many of you who are attending are actually Pinoys, no. But let's say, no, think about that line, provides timely feedback. Do you see an error there when it comes to the Pinoy culture? And you might say, no, that I'm being narrow in my culture perception. Let's just again use this for the purposes of example. Typically, yep, providing feedback is not automatic over chat. What else? Yeah, we tend to be shy in giving feedback. So we're not as direct, right? So you might say when you provide timely feedback, you want to ask is, what you want to ask is that a software, is that a behavior that is conducive to my organization? Am I forcing it? Um, is it too soon? Is it too high a requirement? Maybe take out the word timely, provide feedback. So don't measure the timeliness at the moment. Just measure, did they provide feedback? It doesn't matter if they did it now, if they do it later, if they do it the next year. So long as they are familiar with providing feedback, maybe that's the suitable software given your current hardware, given your current culture. If you feel the culture is already very professional, the culture is really performance driven, maybe that behavior, that criteria of providing timely feedback suddenly now works because there is a harmony between the software and the hardware. Let me know if that makes sense. Let me see some yes, no, or maybe questions over chat. All right, somebody was saying over chat, this is good input because you can have many requirements that might not be immediately applicable to the organization. Immediately applicable or immediately demonstrated. And precisely because, again, it's a different culture. But all right, good question. But what if you want to aspire for that? Well, competence takes time, right? So you want to first have a standard that you think is achievable. Then once that's achieved, shift the standard. And then once that's achieved, shift a standard. And that's how you can slowly elevate the competence of people within an organization. When you force it, it again, it's the behavior might be more compliance rather than commitment. It's because you're setting a bar too high. So you want them to have a progressive development towards a behavior that you really want. And that tells you when you create standards, you're ready for the next possible standard for every competency. So notice, if you have 100 in your library, you're going to begin looking at which of those software um, are aligned to the hardware. And if many of them are not, that's really just so many catalogs, so many lists of competencies that you need to manage. Which is why, going back to the design, Make sure it's the right catalog relative to the why, because that catalog will be the basis of the rest of your actions for using the competency model. Okay, so those are the two design pitfalls: the why and hardware software design, and also behaviors written more in the input tense rather than the output tense. Would appreciate if some of you can shout out over chat if now you realize, well, I think this is what's happening, or it's possible that we do have some of these errors in our organization. Let's see that now. All right, in some government agencies, there is a feedback form wherein you request. So that means um, because of some systems you have, you are ready for that kind of behavior because the system dictates the behavior. Actually, that's actually a wealth of an OD insight. Structure dictates behavior. So your structure of feedback forms prompt the behavior. But you want to question, in prompting the behavior, did you elicit that because of the form? And do you think that elicitation, I don't even know if that's right English, the elicitation of that behavior comes out of commitment or comes out of compliance, right? So here, it's the form, it's a requirement that's causing that behavior. There you go. It might not be natural. That's number one. So in other words, if the trigger wasn't there, would they still behave the same way? Does it become natural to them to provide feedback, or are they dependent on a trigger? And if they're dependent on the trigger, you want to ask, is that real competence? Is that real skill? Okay. So very good to ask. Nice. Nice insight. It could be compliance. Yeah, all right. So you want to so now you want to ask, what's a way to maybe without the trigger, what's a way to expect a certain behavior that's close to what to your ideal image, and that could be your starter criteria. And once everybody is already demonstrating that, you feel confident that everybody's there, that's when you elevate the standard. Okay. 10% design issues, somebody was saying. So you feel it could be that. Okay, so let's shift on to number two. Number two possible area or pitfall that you have fallen into, which is why you're not getting the kind of results that normally we should be getting out of a competency model, is your launch. When we say launch, it has to do with now that you've developed it, you're going to introduce it to the organization. There are typically two gaps when it comes to this area in the launch category. And it has to do with number one, limited awareness. In some organizations, it was really just the designers, the technical working group who did the competency models. They're the only ones aware of the model. They're the only ones aware of what the behaviors mean. They're the only ones who understand the why of the competencies to the whole organization. So much so that when you begin doing number two as part of your launch to implement it, you're going to use it for, let's say, learning needs assessment. You're going to use it for performance assessment, that you end up encountering a wall. What is this competency list? What am I supposed to do with this one? So there's no understanding for those outside of the design group, outside of the technical working group, and suddenly you realize, no, it's beginning to fall apart. Fall apart in terms of not the model, but in terms of the clarity or the intention of the competency model. So it's important that when you launch, you begin involving obviously stakeholders, not just those who are designing it, but ultimately those who will be affected with the competency model. I mentioned this especially because again, I've encountered and worked with many agencies, organizations wherein um, they reported that when they first did their learning needs assessment using the competency model, there were more questions about, why is this required for my position? Why am I expected to demonstrate this behavior, this criteria? And why is that an evidence for this competency? So instead of being a facilitative tool towards a more integrated HR, you actually introduce a confusing model to the organization. And that's because there wasn't any awareness made about it. Again, the what, why, where, when, and mostly the why to make it more compelling. And then also number two, and this actually is related to the first point, the why. If your why in the first place was not clear, normally the where, which is the launch, where you will integrate competencies, will also be not clear. If your why was because of the strategy, you will definitely implement competencies first in performance management. If your why was about performance outcome, you'll link competencies, you'll integrate competencies first in learning and development and also in performance management. If your why is in because we want to develop people, then your integration would be in either career or learning and development. So the why actually dictates your initial use. Again, confusing is we created the competency model because of the strategy and we're going to implement it in compensation. So already there's a disconnect there. So those are the two areas. Again, in the launch issues. Number one, limited awareness of the entire organization. Only just a few are knowledgeable. And then lastly, integration clarity. You didn't know where to implement it. Over chat, somebody was saying, I didn't know there was a quote unquote unscience to where you integrate competencies. Yep, the science or the practicality of implementing it is dependent on the why. And really, di ba? Think about it. This is your why, and so this is the what to the why. The what is we're going to implement it in the right HR process. Eventually, you will implement it across the entire all of the HR functions, but you want to have your zero domino or starting point, and it has to align with the why, the intention of your competency. Okay, let me know over chat. Is this an area of issue that you think you need to look at in order to strengthen your competency model? Is it more about the launch? There you go, some answers. Yes, definitely. Help me. All right, thank you. Over YouTube. Okay, they're quiet over at YouTube. They're listening. Okay. Number three, lastly. So let's say, oh, good question. Can it be can it be a combination of launch and design? Well, yeah, actually your launch might not have the kind of traction that you want because there were design issues in the first place. In fact, I think the design is what you want to get down pat very, very clearly at the onset. Once that design is tight, then you can safely launch. But it's not automatic that you have a good design, you'll be able to launch it well. At least in launching, you know you're launching or introducing something that's robust. But in the launch, the questions are, um, is it clear to the stakeholders? Do they know why they're using it? Do they know how to use it? Also, in your clarity in the design, do you know how to begin to integrate it? Because if you don't integrate it well, then definitely you're going to have again those launch issues. And everything that you launch does require many things. In launching, again, you need to have role models, people who can uh, be the go-to for questions on how it's used and they can answer authoritatively. Also, apart from role models, influencers, the one that will encourage. So it's really largely when you think about integration, it's really about change because you're introducing a new framework for doing an HR process. You're going to say, we're going to do recruitment competency based. You're essentially doing a change. And whenever there's change, it can be uncomfortable. To make it comfortable, to make it less daunting, that kind of change, of course, you can need to create the influencers, the role modelers, the enablers in order to implement change. And there you go, some contribution over chat from PIA, more on integration clarity. So you're in the launch area already. Nice. Okay, others, we did see a lot more health issues. I also, sorry, so with that question, let me know if we answered that one. So it was a question is, can you have both? Yes, you can have both, and it's actually really worse if you have both. But if you want to start somewhere, you want to do the design much, much better. I think based on this, someone saying we need to revisit our competency model. So you feel it could be in the design issue. Can you launch a poorly designed competency? Yes, you can launch a poorly designed competency. So you can succeed in launching, but I tell you, when you begin integrating it, that's when you will find some of the errors. You realize that you ended up, let's say you use a model as a basis for performance management. And in spite of you using it, you're seeing that performance is still not improving. So that makes you ask, so I'm focusing on these competencies to improve performance. How come it is not happening? Now, of course, there are many reasons. It could be the learner's reception. It could be the method that you're using. But if you've isolated those and you think it's none of those that's causing it, then you can begin questioning, was are these the right competencies that will really influence performance, and did we articulate it correctly? Because for all you know, it might be in the design that was the error, which is why you couldn't do the launch or the integration well. And and that's expected, by the way. No launch, I think, is going to be 100% successful. As you launch, you will be able to discover some of the areas that you need to improve on. But that doesn't mean you, well, if you did your design well and you launch it, you will find a couple of errors, probably around 20%. But if you didn't do your design well, the integration is a great revelator. Or is that even a word? Sorry, I keep using incorrect words. That will reveal a lot of the errors that of a poorly designed one. So chain reaction, right? And third, finally, the last issue has to do with sustainability or maintenance of the competency model. Some of the issues here related to maintenance is, number one, no one is really accountable for the competency model. I don't know if that's happening in your organization. Is it going to be recruitment? Is it going to be learning and development? Is it going to be HR at the head? Is it going to be another group? Is it going to be a committee? And while we're not going to answer clearly because it's really different from one agency, one organization to another, they really at the bottom line is there really has to be an owner. And this owner is the one that makes sure that the competency model is is still relevant to the organization. They are the ones who install the process for updating it. They're the ones there to begin refreshing it or updating it. Somebody else was saying also over chat, recruitment, HR, and L&D are the focus areas of their competency integration. And sustaining is a different question. No? In sustaining, you've already launched it, but sustaining is you're really looking out for some of the triggers that will cause you to begin looking at competency model. What do I mean? Well, the pandemic caused a lot of changes for many of us in our organizations, right? Um, and that crisis was actually a revelator. Again, sorry for that word. The crisis revealed how we really are competent in certain areas that we probably didn't think of. Number one, for example, is digital literacy. Literacy with IT, for example, right? When that happened, let's say during the height of the quarantines wherein we all didn't go to our offices, we all stayed at home, we were on lockdown for about three months to 6 months, and we needed to continue the work in the organization. For many of you, probably that revealed no how many didn't have emails, how many didn't know how to access passwords, how many didn't know how to do a report using Excel. Let me know if that was if that's an experience, diba? And that was very surprising. Why are there people who are not knowledgeable about these things when in fact the organization gave them laptops, they have all of these devices available, and suddenly you realize, well, these devices are not being used fully because many are asking, how do we use them, how do we navigate, how do we make a meeting happen over at Zoom or uh, uh, Microsoft Teams. There were many questions around this. And again, that revealed, oh, that's another competency, and that's different from strategic, performance outcome, or individual. That's now a the why this time is the environmental aspect. What changes in the environment that will require you to learn something new. And the pandemic really told us to learn something new. We needed to learn how to digitize or how to navigate in a digital environment. Revealed a competency. So this is what I mean when I say sustain or maintenance. The three triggers usually are: number one, any change in strategy usually results into a change in a competency model. If, for example, um, PIA, for example, only because they're here and I'm going to say hi, and I don't intend to put you on the spot, but in my mind, there are some shifts into the competencies of PIA. When we did the competency model of PIA, social media was not at its height, and the convention for many of communication were more in the traditional aspects, right? Posters, for example, letters and campaigns. But because of where we are now, wherein social media has become a juggernaut, um, that's an area that we need to have some competence in, and because of that, it's actually telling us that we might need to begin developing some sort of new capability, uh, so that we are abreast of this kind of change. And let me know if that makes sense as an example. But right, so even policies can introduce changes. Even, let's say, the simple act of purchasing an HR system. When you purchase an HR system and you implement an HR system, it could change how you do certain operations in HR. So that means it will require new levels of competence, like managing databases, uh, number one, or ensuring that data integrity, things like that. Oh, there you go. So they are abreast. So it looks like, in terms of this is not an issue, PIA was saying we are abreast because now we do have social media handling and management as a competency. There you go. So if that's not the case, there is that title. You want to look at, again, the design, look at the criteria. Are they still the relevant criteria for today given our conditions, or do we need to elevate it? That's really just part of sustainability. And for some of you who are just in your fourth year of your competency model, it might not be an immediate concern, but you will get there at that level later on. Especially when everybody seems to be competent and demonstrating all of the competencies, and yet it's still not creating the performance and it's not achieving the strategy. That sustainability should cause you to ask, do we still have a tight model? Do we need to change the criteria of some competencies? Are there other competencies that we didn't consider that might um, that have a more direct linkage to, again, strategy, performance, or development of people in the organization? And those are the three areas basically, right? So let's just summarize. We're near the end of our session. So number one, typical competency issues are in design. When we say design, it has to do again with the why to your framework, and of course the hardware and software. Design issue is very important. It's the zero domino for the rest. Number two, possible pitfall that you encountered, which is why you're not getting the results of your competency model, is how it was launched. Maybe very little awareness, and also clarity about where to implement it. And then finally, maybe a third issue is how you maintain or sustain it. There is probably no real owner, and then you don't have a process nor the agility by which to respond and really take the competency model at hand. So those are three issues. Now, going back to the title of our session, so how do we strengthen? Well, to strengthen it will be to act on the pitfalls. Very simply, if uh, if your model is not giving the results that a competency model should, then you want to begin strengthening these three areas as well. Strengthen the design, revisit it, update it, check the why, check the harmony of hardware software, reword some of the criteria, revisit your launch. Are there stakeholders who are not yet aware or not as involved as you'd like them to be? And is the integration really succeeding, or does the integration indicate some flaws in the design in the first place? And also, finally, to strengthen your competency model and reap the kind of ROI that's usually out there for you, is to look at how you sustain your model today. Um, Look at how fast and how responsive you are in beginning to update, and ensuring that you have a competency model that's relevant. Okay, so that's it for our session today. We do have a couple of time. Let's see if we can look at some questions over chat that we've seen. Um, Looks like we did answer a couple of them. Excuse me for my cough. All right. Thank you for the insight. Somebody was saying you're welcome. Okay, so that's it. So hopefully you did learn a lot from here. It's a short session. And for those of you who are starting in your competency model, be wary and be alert of those issues. Every time you take a step, oh, we're in the design stage, let's look at those. How often do we need to assess the criteria of competencies? All right. We mentioned one. When you change your strategy, begin asking. Usually it's when you have strategy, systems, and your structure. These are the three things that cause major changes in your competency model. Definitely, if you change your structure, that means you're changing direction, new skills required. If you change your systems, as an example earlier, you bought an HR system that changes all of the processes, new competencies. If you change your structure, again, maybe new competencies as a result of that. The minor causes, so these are major, they can cause you to look to revisit the catalog. If you're just wondering about the content of your competency catalog, those could be changes in terms of skills and or staffing. It could also be in terms of style of the boss. For example, some new administrators will prefer work to be done this way. That means you need to shift some of the competencies or even the standards of those competencies. Let's say some administrators have a bias for decision making. Then that means, all right, let's shift there. Let's have more standards about competencies. Okay. So those are mainly the key drivers of or the triggers that will cause you to begin looking at your competencies again. Big changes, strategy, structure, systems, possible minor changes only. And when you say minor changes, changes in the position profiles, changes in the competency criteria, structure would be about staffing skills and staffing skills style, some of the areas that you want to look at. Okay, we have time for maybe two more questions. You're welcome. Um, notify yours truly once the upcoming felicitate to notify yours truly once there's an upcoming insightful Zoom of yours. All right, to let you know, so just subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's when you find out when we're going to do another live session. So you'll get notifications if you're a subscriber. We're going to do one actually on September again. And we're going to talk about what you want to do to preserve and manage, or first identify linchpin positions and also linchpin talents in the organization. They're actually very useful topics if your organization is into career development as well as succession management. Linchpin positions and linchpin talents. Look forward to that. That's going to happen, I think September 2, if I'm not mistaken. But it's usually I do these live sessions the first week of every month and typically on a Friday. But you'll find out in over at YouTube, because at YouTube I post it ahead of time so you know when it's actually going to be broadcast. You can also click to get notified of when is the session happening, and you can even have that scheduled within your calendar, right? So, and if you feel that some will benefit from our short session today, do share the link. Get everybody to know. And because I've worked with competencies before, I have seen the kind of results that I shared earlier happen in many agencies and organizations. And we do want the same results to happen for your organization, because that's how really competencies can help you. So if you feel you want to learn more, well, then just make subscribe, and we're going to talk a lot more topics here. Also, if you have other questions, you have other topics that you'd like us to cover, just let me know again over YouTube. Just comment over there, and we're going to answer some of your questions. We can make it a webinar. We can even include it in some of the post-session discussions after this live broadcast. Right? So I don't plan to keep you any longer. Thank you again for joining us. It's been fun, actually. I appreciate the questions, the insights that you shared over chat. And I just have good wishes for you in you doing your work. So good luck, and know that I'm just here to help you succeed and get to that level where you want yourself to be and your organizations to be at. Okay, so thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day. Happy Friday, and see you in the next session. Bye bye.